That leads us into the next section of taking a look at some techniques for prioritizing. Okay? Now, just one point is that the chronological order of the way tasks get done has nothing to do with the priority that they take. The priority that they take is typically how much effort, time, resources do we allocate to a higher priority task. Okay? It is possible that a higher priority task might have to come first, but not necessarily. And we'll explain in just a minute. But let's first go ahead and take a look at 6 techniques for how to prioritize. The first technique we're going to look at is the Pareto principle. The next technique we'll look at is what's called Covey's quadrants. The third technique is called the paired comparison matrix. The fourth technique is what's known as the action priority matrix. The fifth technique is what's known as the Carver matrix. And the last and final one we'll be looking at is what's known as triage. Let's start with the Pareto principle. Okay, Wilfredo Pareto was an economist, an Italian economist in the 1900s. He noticed something very interesting, that 80% of the Italian wealth was allocated to 20% of the population. Okay, meaning that the other 20% was shared among 80% of the population. That led him to develop his theory that there's an unequal distribution of efforts as they relate to impact. Okay? Not every time that we put in X amount of efforts will those efforts yield X amount of results. It's possible that we could put in a lot of effort and that effort will only yield a minimum amount of results. With that, he went ahead and developed what's known as the 80-20 rule. Okay? Where 80% of the output is created by 20% of the input. For example, 20% of the pea pods, produce 80% of the peas. Again, an unequal distribution of results as they correlate to efforts. Some of the other areas that the 80-20 rule applies would be as follows. 20% of the donors donate 80% of the donations. 20% of the customers create 80% of the revenue. 20% of the features on a computer program might cause 80% of the usage. Again, the crucial point here is we need to focus on the 20% that counts, the 20% that makes a difference. Now, it's possible that it's not an exact distribution of 80-20. It can be 90-10. It can be 60-40. The bottom line is we need to locate, we need to pinpoint that minimum amount of efforts or the minimum amount of inputs that make the most impact. We need to ignore the rest of the inputs. Okay, so for example, I shouldn't say ignore, but we need to give higher priority to the efforts that really count, to the efforts that make the difference. For example, if 20% of our donors donate 80% of the donations, we want to spend more time focusing on those 20% of the donors. Same thing with our customers. If 20% of our customers create 80% of the revenue, we want to allocate more time. We want to give that 20% of the customers higher priority because that's where the bread is buttered. Okay? That's the Pareto principle. Okay? So again, we have the 80-20 rule. That's where 80% of the results come from 20% of the efforts, of the inputs. There's an uneven distribution of efforts versus outputs. We need to identify the 20% that impacts most, and then we need to focus our resources towards that 20%. That 20% gets the highest priority. Next, let's take a look at Covey's quadrants. Okay, Stephen Covey, a very popular figure in time management today. He's written quite a few books. Most famous of his books is the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He's a professor in the he's a professor right now in the University of Utah. He's a business professor there. One of the books he wrote was called First Things First. In that book, he introduced a system of 4 quadrants. Okay, the 4 quadrants, we'll take a look at in a minute. The 4 quadrants are meant to allow us to organize and execute around priorities, and all the tasks fit into one of those quadrants, one of those 4 quadrants. Okay, now let's take a look at what these 4 quadrants are. Okay, basically it's a grid where we'll compare the importance of a task versus the urgency of a task. Or in the Covey quadrants example, we'll allocate quadrants based on their level of importance versus their level of urgency. Okay, let's take a look at this. First, we'll have a quadrant that is not important but urgent. Then we'll have a quadrant that is important but urgent. Next, we'll have a quadrant that is important and not urgent. And finally, we'll have a quadrant that is not important and not urgent. Okay? In determining what gets higher priority, we need to take a look at the quadrants in more detail. Okay? The important urgent quadrant is what's typically known as the crisis quadrant. Okay? These are all the tasks that fit into this quadrant are what put us into crisis mode. Quadrant 2, the important but not urgent quadrant, is what puts us in prevention mode. Quadrant 3, the not important but urgent tasks are typically disruptive tasks. And quadrant 4, not important and not urgent, are trivial tasks. Okay, and typically we would just ignore quadrant 4. But Stephen Covey points out that in order to organize and execute around priorities, quadrant 2 needs to get the highest priority. Okay, if we don't give quadrant 2 the highest priority, well, quadrant 2 tasks will move into quadrant 1, crisis mode. Now, what's interesting is that quadrant 1 actually gets taken care of first. However, because it's of a lower priority than quadrant 2, it gets less time allocated towards it, it gets less resources allocated towards it, and less inputs in general allocated towards it. But it needs to get taken care of first. So again, quadrant 2 gets the highest priority. Without focusing on the prevention quadrant, without focusing on the tasks that fit into quadrant 2, those tasks will wind up moving in to quadrant 1, crisis mode. Now again, even though quadrant 1 gets taken care of first, it's of a lower priority to quadrant 2. Now, in determining what goes first, now this we're going to take a look at an example of a pickle jar, a pickle barrel. Now this is actually not Stephen Covey's phenomenon. This is just a random example that's that people give. But the pickle jar example is a pretty interesting. That's a pretty interesting perspective. Suppose we have a pickle jar, an empty pickle jar, and we want to get the most. We want to get the most we can. We want to fit the most we can into that pickle jar. At the same time, leave absolutely no airspace. Okay. So what we would typically do is we would take first, make sure it's empty, no water in it, no nothing in it. First, we take the largest pickles and put them in. Okay. Next, we take the smaller pickles and put them in. Third, we'll go ahead and take, let's say, some of the pickling spices. We'll put those in, and then finally we'll put in the water. If we put in the water first, we won't be able to fit anything in. Okay? If we put in the smaller stuff first, if we put in, let's say, the spices first, we don't know how much can fit in, while at the same time leaving space for the smaller pickles. If we put the smaller pickles in first, we don't know how much space is left for the larger pickles. Therefore, we always start with the larger pickles. Now, in determining the order, the chronology of what goes first, it's the same phenomenon. Okay, the important but urgent quadrant, quadrant 1, is what would typically be referred to as the big rocks. Okay, the boulders. Those go in first. Those get taken care of first. Quadrant 2 would be the pebbles. Those would go into the pickle jar second. Quadrant 3 would be the sand, and quadrant 4 would be the water. Okay, again, so we're going to first focus on the bigger rocks. Okay, that's the crisis. That's the crisis quadrant. We need to get rid of them quickly. Next, we're going to try to fit in quadrant 2, the pebbles, as many as we can. Finally, we'll take a look at the sand in quadrant 3, and then we'll fill up the rest with the water in quadrant 4. Okay, so summing it up, Covey's quadrants, all tasks fit into the 4 quadrants. Priority is given to quadrant 2, the prevention quadrant. Quadrant 1, however, the crisis quadrant, gets immediate attention. And then finally, we want to make sure we can fill our time space to the maximum capacity. That's Covey's quadrants in a nutshell. Let's take a look at what's called another technique called paired comparison analysis. Okay, this was developed by L.L. Thurstone. He was a renowned psychologist in the 20s, and he developed what's called the law of comparative judgment. Okay, now the law of comparative judgment actually is quite complex, but from that law, a matrix was derived for a day-to-day prioritization. The basic outline of that matrix is weighing options and pairs, and that's in other words, that's the basic framework for the law of comparative judgment is weighing options and pairs, and the framework for the matrix that was derived from that follows that basic outline of weighing options and pairs. And then once we weigh the options and pairs, we weigh each option against each other relative to each other, we can identify which option in the pair is preferred. Now, what happens is like this. Okay, we need a few things. First of all, we need to list the tasks. Okay? Next, we go ahead and we weigh them against each other. And then we go and assign values to each task and calculate the overall task values. We do it in a in a chart form, in a graph form. Well, let's go through it. Okay?